My father laughed so loudly that half the backyard turned to look at us. "That thing is just a pet," he said, pointing at Ranger, my retired military service dog. "Quit acting like he's some kind of hero." A few relatives chuckled. My younger brother raised his beer and added, "Maybe he can fetch you some respect." I didn't answer. I rested my hand on Ranger's head and watched his ears lift toward the old tool shed behind my father's barn. He wasn't looking at the people laughing. He was locked onto something buried beneath the ground. Dad stepped in front of him and barked, "Get that mutt away from my property." Then Ranger pulled hard on the leash, pawed at the dirt, and let out the same alert bark I had heard years earlier during a classified deployment overseas. That was the moment I realized my father had no idea what he had just started. My name is Emily Carter, and for 8 years, I served in the United States Army as a K-9 handler. I was 29 when Ranger and I completed our final deployment together, but by then, he had already become more than a partner. He was the reason I came home alive. People often thanked me for my service. Very few ever thanked the dog, standing quietly beside me. Ranger never cared. He never looked for applause, medals, or recognition. He only watched my hands, listened for my voice, and trusted me completely. That kind of loyalty changes a person. When I retired after suffering a spinal injury during an overseas operation, Ranger retired too. The Army officially released him into my care, and because of my injuries and post-traumatic stress symptoms, he was also certified as my service dog. To me, he represented survival. To my father, he represented embarrassment. Normal people don't bring dogs into family dinners. He would mutter whenever I visited, "It's not a pet." I would calmly explain. He would wave me off before I could finish. "I know what I'm looking at." The painful truth was that he never actually wanted to know. Growing up, my father believed military service was respectable only if it looked impressive enough for his friends. He liked uniforms during parades and flags on holidays, but he had little patience for invisible wounds or quiet sacrifices. When I enlisted, he called it a phase. When I deployed overseas, he told neighbors I was working with dogs somewhere. Even after receiving commendations, he never asked what I had done or where I had been. Silence became easier than explanation. My mother had understood. Before she passed away from cancer, she used to kneel beside Ranger and scratch behind his ears while telling me, "Some hearts recognize goodness without needing words." After she was gone, visiting my father became harder every year. Still, I kept trying. The annual family barbecue had once been her favorite tradition, and skipping it felt like abandoning the only peaceful memories we had left. So I drove 3 hours, with Ranger lying quietly in the back seat. When we arrived, children ran across the yard chasing fireflies, while country music drifted from an old speaker on the porch. For a moment, everything looked normal. Then my father spotted Ranger climbing out of the truck. He sighed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You seriously brought that dog again?" Before I could answer, Ranger froze. His posture changed in an instant. His nose lifted toward the wind. Then, without barking or pulling, he turned slowly toward the weathered tool shed behind the barn and stared as if he had found something no one else could see. A chill ran through me, because in 8 years together, Ranger had never stared at empty ground without a reason. The first laugh came from my uncle. The second came from my brother. Within seconds, nearly everyone standing near the grill was smiling at my father's latest joke. "Careful," Dad said, as Ranger continued staring toward the old tool shed. "He probably smells leftover burgers." That's about the only training he's got left. A few people nodded, someone whispered. I thought military dogs retired to couches. I could have corrected them. I could have explained that Ranger had spent years locating explosives, hidden compartments, and buried evidence under conditions most people could never imagine. Instead, I stayed quiet. People often mistake restraint for surrender. Ranger, however, never mistook anything. He walked in a slow circle near the edge of the shed, lowered his nose, then sat down with absolute precision. His eyes remained fixed on one patch of dirt beside an old rusted rain barrel. That was not random behavior. That was an alert. My heartbeat quickened. Emily, my father called loudly. Tell your miracle dog to knock it off before he tears up my yard. He's trying to tell us something, I answered calmly. He's trying to get attention, just like you. The words landed harder than he probably intended. For years, he had reduced my service to stories he could dismiss over dinner. He told neighbors I spent my career walking dogs on military bases. He ignored the surgeries after my injury and rolled his eyes whenever Ranger helped steady me during painful days. He never wanted the truth. The smaller he made my life sound, the larger his own seemed by comparison. My younger brother grabbed a shovel, leaning against the fence. Want me to prove there's nothing there? He asked with a grin. Dad shrugged. Go ahead. Maybe the dog can apologize when you find worms. Before my brother reached the spot, Ranger stood and stepped directly in front of him. There was no growl, no aggression, just quiet determination. He blocked the path with the same disciplined posture I had seen during overseas searches. The smile slowly faded from my brother's face. That's actually kind of weird, one cousin murmured. An elderly man I didn't recognize had been sitting alone near the picnic tables, watching without speaking. He wore a faded sheriff's department cap and leaned forward in his chair as Ranger repeated the alert. His expression changed instantly. He stood. Then he looked directly at me instead of my father. Ma'am, he asked in a measured voice, was that dog ever certified to detect buried evidence? Every conversation around the barbecue stopped. Before I could answer, my father interrupted with another laugh. It's just a pet. The older man never smiled. He took one slow step toward Ranger, studied the dog's posture, and quietly reached for the radio clipped to his belt. That was the first moment all afternoon when my father's confidence seemed to crack. I looked at Ranger, and for a moment, the noise of the barbecue disappeared. I was no longer standing in my father's backyard. I was back in eastern Afghanistan, surrounded by dust so thick it swallowed the horizon. Our convoy had been scheduled to move through a narrow mountain road before sunrise. Ranger was walking a few feet ahead of me when he suddenly stopped, sat, and refused to take another step. Some of the younger soldiers thought he was tired. I knew better. His body became perfectly still, his breathing slowed, his eyes locked onto a patch of loose gravel. Minutes later, engineers uncovered a pressure plate connected to an improvised explosive device powerful enough to destroy the first 2 vehicles in our convoy. No one in our unit died that morning because Ranger trusted his training more than human assumptions. That memory had never left me. Neither had the certainty that Ranger did not give false alerts. Back in the present, the retired sheriff crouched several feet away from him, studying every movement. What's his name? He asked quietly. Ranger. And how long did you serve together? 8 years. He nodded once. I've worked with K-9 units before. This dog isn't wandering. He's holding a position. My father rolled his eyes dramatically. For heaven's sake, Harold, don't encourage this. She's been acting like that. Mutt has a college degree since she got back from the army. A few uncomfortable laughs drifted through the crowd. but they faded quickly. The sheriff didn't react. Instead, he looked at me. Has he ever missed? The question hung in the air. I answered honestly. Not once. Silence spread across the yard. Even my brother lowered the shovel he had been joking with. Ranger remained motionless, nose pointed toward the same narrow strip of ground beside the weathered shed. His tail was still. His focus never broke. I had seen this exact posture during searches involving hidden weapons caches, buried electronics, and sealed containers wrapped in plastic. He was communicating the only way he knew how. My father stepped closer and slapped the side of the old rain barrel. There's nothing here. This shed's been standing for 20 years. His voice sounded louder now, almost forced. I noticed sweat gathering near his temples, despite the mild breeze. Then something even stranger happened. When he moved between Ranger and the spot in the dirt, Ranger shifted calmly to maintain his line of sight, refusing to be distracted. It was almost as if he were guarding evidence. The sheriff stood up slowly. He unclipped his radio, but hesitated before speaking into it. Then he turned toward my father. "Sir," he said evenly, "would you object if we took a closer look at that section of ground for the first time all afternoon?" My father didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked toward the shed, then toward the dirt, and finally toward me. In that single uneasy glance, I saw something I had never expected to see in his face. Not anger, not embarrassment, fear. Absolutely not. My father's response came so quickly that even he seemed surprised by it. No one is digging up my property because of a dog. The retired sheriff, Harold Jensen, remained calm. He folded his arms and glanced at Ranger, who still hadn't moved from his alert position. "With respect," Harold said, "that's not normal canine behavior. He's indicating something very specific." Dad forced a laugh. "He's indicating that he wants lunch." No one joined in this time. The laughter that had filled the backyard only minutes earlier had vanished, replaced by uneasy glances and whispered conversations. My aunt slowly lowered the paper plate she'd been holding. My cousin looked from Ranger to the ground and back again. I kept one hand on Ranger's harness. He was steady, focused, patient, exactly the way he had been during dozens of searches overseas. My younger brother tried to break the tension. "Come on, Dad, let me dig a couple inches. If there's nothing there, everybody goes back to eating." "No!" The word snapped through the air. My father's jaw tightened. I said, "Leave it alone." That answer caught everyone off guard. He had never cared much about the flower beds, the old barn, or even the collapsing fence behind the shed. Yet suddenly, he was acting as if a patch of dirt was sacred ground. Harold noticed it too. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," he said carefully, "but unusual resistance usually gives me more reason to ask questions, not fewer." Dad's face reddened. "This is my land, and no one's disputing that." He paused. "But your daughter's service animal is performing exactly as a trained detection dog would." For the first time all afternoon, several relatives looked at me instead of my father, not with pity, with curiosity. I reached into my truck and retrieved a weathered leather binder. Inside were Ranger's retirement papers, veterinary certifications, and military working dog documentation issued when custody transferred to me after our final deployment. I handed them to Harold without a word. He read quietly for nearly a minute. Then he looked up. This dog was certified to detect buried explosives, concealed materials, and evidence caches. He closed the folder. And according to these records, He earned commendations during active service. The backyard fell silent enough to hear wind moving through the trees. Dad scoffed. So, what, he's retired? I met his eyes. So am I. Neither of us looked away. Harold slowly returned the binder to me. I've trusted experienced K, 9S, before, he said. Ignoring them usually turns out to be a mistake. Just then, Ranger's ears perked again. He took 2 careful steps forward, lowered his nose, and scratched once at the same spot beside the rain barrel. The dirt shifted, something metallic glinted beneath the surface before disappearing again under loose soil. My father inhaled sharply. It was almost imperceptible, but I saw it. So did Harold. Without another word, the retired sheriff reached into his pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and quietly requested assistance from the county office. As he ended the call, he looked at my father and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, if there's nothing buried there, you have nothing to worry about." My father didn't answer. He simply stared at the ground that Ranger refused to leave. The first county deputy arrived less than 20 minutes later. Then another. Neither of them came with flashing lights or raised voices. They parked quietly outside the gate and walked into the backyard as if they understood that whatever was about to happen required patience more than drama. Harold met them halfway across the lawn. He showed them Ranger's certification papers and spoke in low tones while occasionally pointing toward the tool shed. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Former Army K-9. Reliable handler. Repeated alert. Potential buried evidence. My father folded his arms. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly. "You're all letting a dog tell you how to run an investigation." One of the deputies, a woman about my age named Lisa Moreno, looked directly at him. "No, sir," she replied evenly. "We're listening to trained observations and evaluating them." There was a difference. She understood it. So did I. Ranger remained fixed on the same patch of earth. Even with strangers walking nearby and children being ushered into the house by worried parents, his concentration never wavered. Deputy Moreno approached me. "How long have you worked together since he was 2? And you trust him with my life?" She nodded, as though that answer told her everything she needed to know. The conversation reminded me of another mission years earlier, during a joint operation overseas. An impatient contractor had insisted Ranger was giving a false indication near a supply container. He demanded the convoy move on schedule. My commanding officer ignored him and trusted Ranger instead. Inside the hidden compartment, investigators later found stolen military equipment and falsified shipping records tied to a procurement fraud scheme. The contractor disappeared from the operation within days. That incident earned Ranger an official commendation. It also taught me that truth often waits beneath the surface, while pride argues above it. Back in my father's yard, the deputies requested permission to inspect the area more closely. Dad hesitated. "I want a lawyer." Harold answered calmly, "You're free to contact one." No one moved. A breeze rustled through the old oak trees, carrying the smell of charcoal and cut grass across the suddenly quiet gathering. The barbecue had become something entirely different. People who had laughed at Ranger earlier now watched him with cautious respect. My brother avoided my eyes altogether. Then Deputy Moreno knelt near the alert point. She brushed away a thin layer of loose soil with a gloved hand. Almost immediately, her fingers tapped against something solid. Metal. She looked up at Harold without saying a word. He slowly stood and addressed everyone in the yard, For everyone's safety and to preserve whatever may be here, I'm asking that no one enter this area." The guests instinctively stepped backward. Even my father complied. Ranger finally relaxed his posture, sat beside me, and leaned gently against my injured leg, as though his work was done. I scratched behind his ears. "You found it again," I whispered, but none of us yet understood just how much that buried object was about to change. The deputies didn't rush. They marked off the area with tape borrowed from one of their patrol vehicles and asked everyone to stay back. My relatives gathered in uneasy clusters across the lawn, whispering to one another. The same people who had laughed at Ranger an hour earlier now watched him as if he possessed something almost supernatural. He didn't. He simply trusted his training. Deputy Moreno used a small hand shovel rather than heavy equipment. She scraped away the loose soil inch by inch, preserving whatever lay beneath. Harold stood beside her while another deputy photographed the site. My father paced near the porch. "This is insane," he muttered. "You're turning a family barbecue into a crime scene." No one answered him. After several careful minutes, the shovel struck something hard with a dull metallic tap. Moreno stopped immediately. Using gloved hands, she brushed away the remaining dirt until the edge of a weatherproof steel case came into view. It was rectangular, heavily sealed, and coated with years of mud and corrosion. The crowd collectively held its breath. Harold knelt beside it. "Well," he said quietly, "your dog definitely found something." My father's face lost what little color remained. "It's probably junk," he blurted out. "An old toolbox. Previous owners buried things all the time." "That's possible," Harold replied, but his voice carried none of my father's certainty. The deputies lifted the container onto a folding table borrowed from the barbecue setup. It was heavier than it looked. One of the latches had nearly rusted shut, requiring careful work with a flat screwdriver. I stood several feet away with Ranger sitting perfectly still at my side. He never looked at the box. His attention stayed on me, almost as if he already knew his job was finished. When the final latch released, Deputy Moreno slowly lifted the lid. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't weapons. It was a stack of sealed document envelopes wrapped in waterproof plastic, several faded photographs, a flash drive stored inside a protective case, and a small lockbox containing paperwork tied together with brittle twine. Harold removed the top envelope. Across the front, written in handwriting I recognized instantly, were 4 words for Emily. "If found." My knees nearly gave way. It was my mother's handwriting. I hadn't seen it in over 7 years. A gasp rippled through the backyard. My aunt covered her mouth. My brother stared at the envelope without speaking. Only my father moved. He took one hurried step toward the table. "That doesn't belong to her," he said sharply. "Those are private family papers." Harold raised one hand. "Sir, I need you to stay where you are." For the first time in my life, my father obeyed another man without argument. His shoulders sagged. His eyes remained fixed on the envelope bearing my name. Then Harold noticed something tucked beneath it. He carefully pulled out a notarized folder, stamped with an attorney's seal, and looked at the date. It had been prepared less than 3 weeks after my mother's funeral. He looked from the folder to my father, then back to me, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I think your dog just uncovered the beginning of a very different story." No one touched the envelope at first. Harold asked one of the deputies to photograph everything exactly as it had been found before carefully removing the plastic wrapping. The attorney's folder, however, caught his attention immediately because the seal was still intact. "It's addressed to the Carter family," he said, "and there's a notarized instruction to open it If these documents are ever recovered, my father took a shaky breath. This is getting blown out of proportion. Harold broke the seal and unfolded the first page. The backyard fell silent except for the rustle of paper. He read for nearly a minute before looking up at me. "Emily, these documents state that your late mother established a protected trust in your name after your final deployment." I stared at him, unable to speak. "That's impossible," my father interrupted. "There was never any trust." Harold continued reading. "The trust was funded with life insurance proceeds, family investments, and compensation related to your military injury. According to this document, the assets were to remain untouched until they could be transferred directly to you." My brother blinked in confusion. "Dad, you told us Mom left almost nothing." My father's mouth opened, but no words came out. Harold reached for another document. This one appears to be signed by the family attorney. He adjusted his glasses. It states that the trust paperwork and supporting records were placed in secure storage after concerns arose that they might be destroyed or concealed. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. There's an attached handwritten statement. He read it aloud. "If these papers are discovered outside the attorney's custody, it means someone intentionally removed them. Emily deserves the truth. She has always deserved the truth. The words belong to my mother." I recognized every curve of her handwriting. Across the yard, my aunt began to cry quietly. My father sank into a lawn chair without being asked. For years, he had insisted that financial hardship forced him to sell family property, postpone repairs, and decline opportunities. He had told everyone there simply wasn't enough money after Mom died. Now, a different story was unfolding in front of every witness. Deputy Moreno carefully examined the lockbox and recovered bank statements, correspondence, and receipts dating back years. Nothing suggested a simple misunderstanding. Everything suggested deliberate concealment. No one looked at Ranger anymore, as though he were just a pet. Instead, people looked at him with quiet respect. He had uncovered the one thing no family argument, no accusation, and no memory could erase: evidence. Harold closed the folder and faced my father. "Sir, I'm not making legal conclusions today, but these materials raise very serious questions about why they were buried." My father lowered his head into his hands. The loudest man at the barbecue had become the quietest. I knelt beside Ranger and wrapped an arm around his neck. He leaned gently into me, calm as ever. He didn't understand money. He didn't understand inheritance. He only understood that years ago, he had been trained to find what others tried to hide. And once again, he had done exactly that. Harold set the legal documents aside and carefully picked up the envelope with my name written across the front. He looked at me before speaking. "This belongs to you." My fingers trembled as I broke the brittle seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter, folded 3 times and yellowed with age. The moment I unfolded it, I recognized my mother's careful script. "Emily, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally found its way back to you." I had to stop reading for a moment. The tears came quietly, not because I was weak, but because I hadn't heard her voice in so many years. Around me, the backyard remained completely still. Even the children inside the house seemed to sense that something important was happening. I continued, "Your father loved us once, but fear changed him. He became so afraid of losing control that he began hiding things instead of facing them. I discovered documents he intended to keep from you, including the trust and the compensation that belonged to your future. I confronted him, but I no longer believed promises alone would protect you. So I asked our attorney to prepare copies. If the originals ever disappeared, I wanted there to be another chance for you to know the truth. Most of all, I wanted you to remember this: never measure loyalty by volume. The loudest people often abandon us first. Measure it by quiet actions. Then I looked down at Ranger. He rested his head gently against my knee, exactly as he had done after difficult missions overseas. My mother had added one final paragraph. Take care of that remarkable dog. He sees what people choose not to see. I closed my eyes. For years, I had believed I was carrying Ranger through retirement. In some ways, he had been carrying me. Harold quietly accepted the letter back, only long enough to document it, before returning it to my hands. The deputies compared the handwritten pages with notarized samples recovered from the lockbox and found every signature consistent. They also reviewed the bank records and attorney correspondence, confirming that the buried materials matched official filings from years earlier. No accusations were shouted. No dramatic arrests took place. The evidence itself spoke more clearly than anger ever could. Across the yard, my father finally stood. He walked toward me slowly, his shoulders bent in a way I had never seen before. I was ashamed, he admitted softly. After your mother died, I convinced myself I deserved control over everything she left behind. Every year that passed made it harder to admit what I'd done. I listened without interrupting. Then I answered with the only truth that mattered. You didn't bury those papers because you forgot about me. I paused. You buried them because you hoped everyone else would. He lowered his eyes. For the first time since I was a little girl, he had nothing left to say. The deputies packed the recovered documents into evidence bags before leaving copies of the inventory with Harold and me. Formal legal proceedings would come later, but everyone standing in that backyard already understood the truth. No one looked at my father the way they had that morning. The loud certainty he had worn like armor was gone. My brother approached me first. I should have defended you, he said quietly, glancing at Ranger. I thought Dad was exaggerating, but I never questioned him. I nodded. I know. It wasn't forgiveness. It was simply the beginning of honesty. My aunt stepped forward next and wrapped her arms around me. Through tears, she admitted she had always wondered why my mother seemed worried during the last months of her life, but had never asked the difficult questions. Silence, I realized, protects the wrong people when it lasts too long. Finally, my father walked toward me. He looked older than he had only hours before. I can't change what I did, he said, but I'm sorry. I studied his face, searching not for perfect remorse, but for responsibility. Then I answered as calmly as I could. I spent years thinking you were ashamed of my service. He lowered his eyes. I wasn't ashamed of your service, he whispered. I was ashamed that your courage made my excuses impossible to ignore. The words hung between us. For the first time, I understood that he had never mocked Ranger because he believed the dog was ordinary. He mocked Ranger because Ranger reminded him of everything he himself had failed to be faithful, disciplined, and impossible to deceive. I reached down and unclipped Ranger's leash. He didn't run. He simply stayed beside me, waiting for the next instruction as he always had. That quiet loyalty had uncovered more than buried documents. It had uncovered the truth inside our family. As the sun dipped below the trees, guests quietly loaded their cars and drove away. The barbecue grills cooled. Paper plates blew across the grass. Conversations ended in whispers instead of laughter. Before leaving, Harold shook my hand. Your partner earned everyone's respect today. He earned it a long time ago, I replied. Today, everyone else finally caught up. I placed my mother's letter inside the same leather binder that held Ranger's military certifications and retirement papers. The two belonged together. One represented unconditional love. The other represented unconditional loyalty. When I climbed into my truck, Ranger settled into the passenger seat with a contented sigh. I started the engine, but paused before pulling away. Looking back through the windshield, I realized something important. The greatest thing my service dog ever found wasn't a buried lockbox or forgotten legal papers. It was the truth my family had spent years trying not to see. And once the truth comes to light, no amount of dirt can bury it again. Sometimes, the greatest truths are uncovered not by the loudest voices, but by the quietest acts of loyalty. People may dismiss your scars, your service, or even the companions who stand beside you, yet character has a way of revealing itself when it matters most. Never let someone else's doubt convince you to shrink your worth. Stay faithful to your principles. Protect those who have earned your trust, and remember that integrity can remain buried for a season, but it cannot stay hidden forever. In the end, respect is not won through arguments or applause. It is earned through consistent courage, quiet dignity, and the unwavering choice to do what is right, even when no one else believes in you.